This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
Welcome back everyone to the X-Cast, The Truth is in Here. I'm your host Tony Black and this is I Want to Believe Minute, where we unpick the second X-Files movie 1 minute at a time. Today, helping me to explore minute 56, running from approximately 55 minutes, with Scully talking to Christian's parents through to 55 minutes 59 seconds as Christian's mother asks Scully if she can save her son, is author, critic and podcaster Darren Mooney. Welcome to I Want to Believe Minute, Darren.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to talk about these 8 lines.
I said off air that I've roped Darren in for what I would say is a small block of episodes, the next 3 minutes, but they're not the most dynamic, exciting minutes in the film. But I'm confident we're going to get 3 dynamic, exciting podcasts out of it, Darren.
I mean, isn't one of the famous X-Cast kind of lost stories the myself and Chris Knowles talking about, is it Providence and Provenance for something like 3.5 hours? And those are meant to be like minisodes. Those are meant to be 20 minutes long, and I think we sent them on to yourself and Carl that it was like 3 hours.
Yeah, it was for
one
the
of the
pod
great
watch.
Pod Watch.
The Pod Watch that were minisodes. That was
the last time I was allowed to host the show.
Oh, they are epic episodes. Well, we're not going to quite do 3 hours, but we'll definitely do a fair bit as we talk about this minute. But before we start, quick reminder to follow. You can follow me personally on social media at Linktree, linktr.ee/AJ and the Xcast on social media through Linktree as well, linktr.ee/the Xcast. And if you're enjoying the show, please do drop us a quick 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts. That'll really, or Spotify or whatever you use, because it'll really help the show. Also, don't forget you can subscribe to our Patreon. Patreon.com/the Xcast. You'll get early releases of these minutes and all the other episodes, lots of bonus content that we've done over the years, and loads more and things like that. So please do support us that way, keep the X-Files chatter going. But we're going to start like we do every block when we get someone new on. And although, Darren, you are far from new to the Xcast, you're new to I Want to Believe Minute. So let's start with a little bit of background on it with you, because it's the first time you're talking about it exclusively on the podcast. So when did you first see I Want to Believe Minute, Darren?
When did I first see I Want to Believe Minute?
I did say that.
I mean, it would have been all of 3 or 4 minutes ago when you asked me to join the Zoom meeting.
Exactly. It's been a long journey. Right, take 2.
Obviously.
When did you first see I Want to Believe, Darren?
Obviously, this movie came out in the summer of 2008, as I am sure absolutely everybody on this podcast has talked about. It was famously steamrolled by The Dark Knight, which had released a couple of weeks earlier. So I did not get to see this in cinemas. That was 2008. That was the year before I started the movie blog.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So it was before I'd even begun semi-professionally or casually professionally reviewing films. I had just gotten out of college. I was looking for a job. I was trying to survive in what at that moment was the recession economy. So I didn't have a lot of disposable income. I didn't necessarily have a lot of free time. I didn't get to see this in theaters. Looking back over my own film log, my own film blog, I can see that I watched it the following September. I have a sneaking suspicion I probably watched it on Sky Movies, which I probably watched while I was visiting my parents one weekend, sponging off them in that post-college phase that I was in. And it's kind of an interesting film in that sense, because I wasn't really chomping at the bit for this. And again, maybe this is sacrilegious to say on the Xcast. I mean, I have written a book about the X-Files. I love the X-Files to death. I'm not a skeptic about the show by any means. But I think when the show came back in movie form in 2008, there was a sense, at least for me, of do I, using the royal we, but do we need the X-Files again? This was a show that had, run its course. It had been a dominant cultural force in the 90s. It kind of dwindled in the early 2000s. It had ended with a bit of a whimper. Was there anything to be had in going back to the well? Like, were my memories of the show going to be in some way diminished by this association? Did I need the coda that this movie would provide? And I kind of found myself at a bit of a bit disengaged from the movie. So I kind of only ended up watching it by chance, stumbling across it on television. And that's kind of how I came to it. And it's an odd movie because it has that thing a bit like the revival does. And again, you guys are going to cover, and hopefully I'll in some form get to cover the revival on the show. But the revival is an interesting beast because it always seems like Carter, when he should be winding down, he gets about halfway through and decides, no, I'm actually ramping up. It's like, should I deliver a stirring closing chapter to the X-Files? And you sit down, you start to watch it, and you're like, wait, it sounds more like he's planning to do another 9 years of this. And I want to believe it's an odd film in that sense because it doesn't really feel like it's providing closure. It doesn't really feel like the end of anything. I don't think, watching it. It doesn't really feel like it ties a bow or anything. It often feels like Carter's trying to get started again. Because, obviously, I'm worried I'm rehashing things people have already said. Very famously, he'd run the X-Files for 9 seasons. He'd made a feature film in the middle of that. That was an incredible amount of work for any person. He'd also made Millennium and Harsh Realm at the same time. He functioned as an executive producer or Godfather type figure on The Lone Gunman. He put in his hours. I think like Dean Haglund makes the point that like after the X-Files ended, Carter just like went to surf and climb mountains for 4 years. He's talked about like getting a drum kit and learning how to drum because that's he was kind of at a loose end and needing to do anything. And again, I'm sure people have talked about this, the delay in getting this movie off the ground after Fox decided it was something they wanted to do around about 2004, 2005-ish, where because Carter was suing Fox. And again, Carter very diplomatically has said, it wasn't an aggressive thing. It was just a matter of sorting out rights and ownership. But basically, the sense in which, by the time this arrived in 2008, I'm like, does the world need the X-Files anymore? And, I don't know that the movie answers it. I think, and we'll talk about ratings and my general opinion of it in a moment, I think the context of the movie changes because of the existence of the revival. I think I Want to Believe is a very different film now than it was, even 5 years ago or 6 years. At this stage, 7 years ago. Time flies, 8 years ago, however long. Because it doesn't have the burden of being potentially the last piece of the X-Files. It just feels like something that goes in the gap between the original run and the revival series. And I think that is something that benefits it. I think it's something that is quite kind to it. I think I Want to Believe works better not having the weight of being, this might be the last time you see Mulder and Scully. To it. So I think it's an interesting movie to talk about and to situate in the context of when it was released and how it exists now.
No, completely, yeah. I think the opinion of it has changed for sure. I mean, so what would you mentioned it just then, but what is your opinion on it then? So what do you think of it? Whether you want to say what you thought of it then or how you think of it now, whether there's any change, but generally, what would you give it out of 10 as well if you had to rank it and rate it?
I'd probably give it about a 5. And that sounds very harsh and that's very unfair. But I do. At the time, I was quite disenfranchised, sort of disenchanted with it, so to speak. I was quite put off by it. It has certain rough edges, and I think, look, Frank Spotnitz, who co-wrote the script, has owned up to those rough edges that, felt kind of out of date even in the context of 2018 and feel even more out of date now. And look, I'll leave it to people who are far more informed about these things to talk about them later in the pod watch as they come up. But I do think that, it is a very dated piece in some senses. However, as I said, without the burden of this being the last time I've seen Mulder and Scully, I've warmed to it a bit more. Having seen the revival and getting a sense of what late Carter feels like, for lack of a better word, post drum kick Carter, if you will, post mountain climbing and surfing Carter, if you will as well, but getting a sense of what he's interested in as a writer, what drives him and the stories he's trying to tell, I do think I have a greater appreciation of Want to Believe. And I will say, like, reading other people's writing on this has helped me a great deal as well. Like, I think Ebert's review of it is very good. Chris Knowles' writing on it is revelatory. That's kind of become a touchstone for me, at least in terms of my understanding of the film. And I think as I've gotten a bit further away from it, I've come to appreciate it more. And this is going to sound very pretentious, but this is an X-Files podcast looking at I Want to Believe minute by minute. I've come to appreciate it more as like a parable, as like a gigantic metaphor, where what the movie is about, in the sense of, like, if you ask me to give you a plot summary, is not what the movie is about at all. And it's actually just a surface layer, a layer of ice, so to speak, over something much deeper and much darker and much more interesting and much more compelling, which is something much more closely tied to who Mulder and Scully are, what both of them want, and how their histories are defined, in ways that are only seldom acknowledged in the text itself. And look, this is probably a nice segue into the minute we're going to talk about here. But, like, this is a very strange movie, and it's hard to explain how strange it is to people who I guess are listening to a minute-by-minute account of I Want to Believe, and therefore we're all X-Files fans here. So we know all this stuff going in, we can situate it in the context of the show, but if you're a general audience member showing up in 2008, right? This is a movie that is ostensibly a standalone Monster of the Week episode. Like, that was what Carter talked about wanting to do. He was like, look, I saw Fight the Future as a big mythology movie. I Want to Believe to be more like a standard early season you tune in Monster of the Week story. We even went back to Vancouver to capture that atmosphere, right? And to be fair to the movie, it isn't overly dense in terms of literal scripted dialogue-driven continuity, right? So, you know, if you're watching this movie, you know Mulder is exiled from the FBI, but the term super soldier is never mentioned, for example. Doggett and Reyes are never even acknowledged in the context of this movie. There's a moment in this movie early on where they go to the FBI headquarters and they notice a picture of President Bush on the wall, and the X-Files theme plays, and the two of them glance at each other as if to say, boy, isn't it weird that Bill Clinton isn't president now? And you're like, that only makes sense, right? If you're a casual viewer who assumes the X-Files ended sometime in the late 90s when people stopped watching it. It's like, oh yeah, the X-Files, it's associated with the Clinton era. So of course they think seeing a picture of George Bush in the FBI building is very odd. But then if you're an X-Files fan, you're like, no, but wait, the show ran 2 seasons into the Bush presidency. The show's aborted ending would have featured the Toothpick Man meeting George W. Bush. You can't really pull a fast one of, Mulder and Scully, George W. Bush, what an odd combination. It's a very, very, very strange choice. There's another kind of moment early on as well where Scully goes to visit Mulder in his seclusion. And where he does the standard thing of, look, I'm busy, I'm occupied, I don't need to be involved in the FBI, I've got plenty occupying me. And she looks up at the ceiling and sees all the pencils, right? And it's like, we're X-Files fans. We understand exactly what that means. That is, Scully has gone on vacation, left Mulder by himself, and so he's thrown pencils up at the roof in the style of Chinga from the 5th season. If you do not have that background context, you're like, wait, what?
What
like, if
is
you
that?
just, if you went to the cinema and you popped down your $5, like, I want to see an X-Files, I want to see a scary movie, a serial killer movie. You're like, what the hell is that? And, like, it's so densely woven into the fabric of the movie, right? And yes, the movie does acknowledge both, like, Samantha Mulder, in that you have the conversation about, oh, your sister's dead. And the moment where Scully's like, you can't save her. Stop trying to save her by saving other people, which renders subtext as text. You also have, like, the script does fleetingly and passingly acknowledge the fact that Mulder and Scully had a son that they gave up for adoption and that maybe Scully carries some scars from it. But if you didn't watch the show, you will have a great deal of difficulty parsing the emotional arcs of this movie, which is Mulder still processing the loss of Samantha, Scully still processing the death of William, and the idea that both of these subplots are basically allegorical journeys for these characters that exist in the context of larger character arcs tied to the show that ran for 9 seasons. Like, it's a really weird mix where this movie is assuming you don't remember Doggett and Reyes from the final season of The X-Files, but it also emotionally requires you to be invested in the idea that William was a baby who was given up for adoption, and that has scarred both Mulder and Scully. It's a very strange balancing act that I admire academically in that, like, it's just bizarre to say all this stuff out loud, but I also... I understand why, if you're a member of the general audiences in, 2008, you're like, wait, what was that? Like, what, it was a movie, it was like a Silence of the Lambs ripoff that was doing Frankenstein and had a pedophile priest in it. Like, how does this all tie together? What's it connecting to? What's the point here? What's going on? So it is, like, it's a very strange beast, and it's a movie that I think, as X-Files fans, both you and I, and everybody listening to this, we don't really think of it that way, because we're like, oh yeah, of course it's a metaphor for William. Of course it's a metaphor for Samantha. What are you talking about? It's right there. It's right there.
When it's actually, an appropriate metaphor, one giant Frankenstein's monster of a film, really,
yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, like, again, so much of this was reverse engineered. Again, I worry I'm talking about things people already know, but like Fox being like, okay, it's got to be $30 million, and it's got to be standalone, and, it's got to be, like, so many of these constraints kind of reverse engineered and kind of applied to the movie, and Carter then just having to work her way around it, where it's like, okay, I guess we're making a movie that will somehow only cost $30 million to make. And it's like, wow, this is what you end up with.
It's I think that's a good summation, really. Of,
PG-13. It had to be PG-13 as well. That was another constraint imposed by Fox. It's going to be $30 million and PG-13. And Carter's like, so, pedophile priests, Frankenstein monsters.
Yeah, it is a strange one. It is a strange one.
And it has to be, like, the script has to be done before the writer's strike kicks off as well. So not only do you have a limited budget and, like, you can't go for the R rating, you also have to have a finished script in, like, 3 weeks. It's a miracle the film works in any way at all, and I was going to
say, based on that, it is actually, because parts of it do absolutely work, and it looks it looks quite good in places, etc. So the fact it did come together to some extent is a testament to them, really. But it is a strange beast, and this minute that we're talking about, it is a pretty standard minute, really. It is Scully talking to Christian's parents. And there's a little bit of dialogue here, and it is it's mostly about that contrast between Christian's parents, who want to put their faith in God, they want to stop the treatment, and Scully is attempting to trying to get them to consider science, essentially, by questioning if it's the wrong choice by putting faith in God. And she said, and you mentioned the William thing. She gets the mother thing sort of thrown back in her face. The mother says, "Well, if you were a mother, you'd understand." And Scully just has to soak that up, really. But I suppose
if you're a casual viewer, do you get that insult, or do you just go, "Wait, what's going on here? Did she never have kids? Is that what the point is? Well, is it that she doesn't have, like?"
I can't remember whether
have they mentioned William later. I don't know if they've mentioned him before.
That's what I was going to ask. I think because it's the scene where they're in bed, isn't it? I think.
Yeah.
Where they talk about William.
Where they're cuddling and they're reading The Wasps.
Yeah. I think that comes a little bit after this. I might be wrong, but yeah, exactly.
Oh, no, you're right. It is before. It's because of William. You think our son left us with an emptiness that can't be filled. Okay. So it was before, to be fair.
Yeah. So you've got that a little bit. So I suppose it would work in that sense. But yeah, from an outsider, it wouldn't have the resonance it has for us as fans, But I suppose that the thing to talk about with this is the Christian plotline, essentially. That's what I wanted to ask you, Darren. And whether or not it works, as a component of the film. So what's your take on this subplot within this whole film with Christian and Scully?
I don't think it works in the context of the film. If you're treating the film as a self-contained object where it is obviously structured as a counterpoint to like the Father Joe plot, where it's like, here is a man who has abused children and here is a child who is being saved. And here is a man who was part of an institution that abused children, and here is Scully working with that same institution that possibly protected or at least enabled him, and which is now trying to sacrifice this child, and Scully is trying to fight back against it. You can see the lines the movie is trying to connect there. You can see how these two elements overlap with one another, and you get the scene towards the end where Mulder kind of spells it out rather bluntly, where it's like, look, maybe he did send you a message and maybe it did pay off, and maybe Christian is the real redemption here for Father Joe, him telling you not to give up. But I don't think it works in the context of this being a self-contained narrative. I don't think the two threads of this individual movie overlap strongly enough that you can tie Father Joe to Christian and get that dramatic payoff in a way that you need to. I do think it works better in the context of Christian is very obviously a stand-in for William, in that like he is the child that Scully is saving, and by saving that child, she grants herself some measure of forgiveness or redemption for abandoning William, or for what she sees as abandoning William. And again, obviously, this is something that Carter comes back to more explicitly in the revival. Like, William is like it's fascinating what is and isn't on Carter's mind when it comes to those final seasons of the X-Files, where it's like, yeah, Doggett and Reyes, I guess we can do something with Anna Belkish, I guess, maybe she'll turn out to be evil, I guess, but it's like, no, but William is where everything lies. William is the pin that holds all of this together. So it is kind of, it makes sense, and particularly, like, not to put too fine a point on it, but the way in which William was handled in the 9th season of The X-Files, where he is, like, super-powered baby and then written out at the last minute when they realize the show's not going to go on, and, like, doesn't even really come up that much in the context of, like, the finale. Like, when Mulder and Scully are lying in bed together, it's not like there's an absence. That final shot isn't meant to make you think, oh, but what about the kid they had and just gave up? Like, if you watch William, the vibe of William is very much, you do not need to worry about William anymore. We got rid of his superpowers and we dumped him in the middle of nowhere with these people you don't know. He's out of the show. We can focus on everything else now. So if you watch I Want to Believe in the context of 2008, William isn't at the forefront of your mind, because you're like, yeah, William's just one of those things the show ditched, like Doggett, like Reyes, that sort of thing. It's the kind of thing that the show doesn't really care about anymore. But when you go back to it after watching the revival, you're like, oh yeah, no, William haunts every frame of this movie.
Yeah.
And it's a very interesting kind of effect where, again, I don't know if it works as a movie. I don't know if it works in the context of this movie, but I do think it works kind of thematically. I do also, before we move off the minute there, because I think, like, we've talked, there are 7 lines here, and you've mentioned like 3 of them. One I want to focus on, which is the Scully line, which is the what if it did work? What if we found we'd made the wrong choice by stopping? And that kind of, maybe I'm reading too much into it. Maybe I'm assuming too much authorial intent to Carter and to Spotnitz. But, like, it does feel a little bit to the point I made about, like, I Want to Believe in the revival, which is the thing where Carter never seems to want to stop. He just seems to start. Like, he shows up and he's like, okay, this is gonna be a farewell to these characters. I'm gonna close the book on it. And then it's like, actually, I quite enjoy writing these characters, and I have a plan that will last for several years mapped out for them. There is a sense of, like, obviously, by the end of the X-Files, everybody working on that show was exhausted. 9 years working a television show is incredibly emotionally and physically draining. And again, we talked about it on the Xcast episodes covering it. But things like the rumors that Carter didn't show up in the writer's room for the 9th season until the last minute. The fact that he's talked about how he would have liked to have been done with the X-Files in season 5, but he stayed with it longer because he felt he owed a debt to Anderson and Duchovny. And, again, that Haglund quote about him disappearing to, go surfing and climb mountains for 3 years. I do get the sense, watching I Want to Believe, that Carter kind of comes back and goes, Could we do the X-Files again? This thing that, this gigantic behemoth of pop culture, this thing that took nearly a decade of my life. That line Scully says, what if we found we'd made the wrong choice by stopping? And the fact that so much of this movie is based around the idea of, God literally telling Scully to keep doing what she wants to do. To not listen to reason, to not listen to authority, to not listen to the people telling her to let this kid die, Christian, and instead going, no, but if you try really hard, you can revive it and bring it back to life. I do kind of wonder if there's an element of self-awareness there, where Carter and Spotnitz are working through this idea of, but what if we did do the X-Files again? What if we did get the band back together? And what if we did go back to Vancouver? And what if we made a movie? And what if, people liked that movie, or we liked that movie, or everybody getting together found that we liked being together? What if stopping the X-Files was a mistake? What if we could just do this thing forever? Which is just a fascinating energy for this movie, where it's if this is a wrap-up movie, if this is think of is it El Camino, the Breaking Bad movie, that's meant to be okay, we're wrapping a bow around this character's journey, this character's storyline, this is a treat for the fans and for ourselves, it's a bookend, it's a loose end that we want to tie off. The energy of I Want to Believe is no, but you see, you stopped doing the X-Files, and that's the problem. You need to keep doing the X-Files forever, because there's something powering you and driving you, and something that needs you. It's a very strange energy for the movie that I think, again, makes more sense in hindsight. I think if you're watching this in 2008, and you're hearing the script go, but what if the X-Files just, didn't end? You're that's so 6 years ago. It's been 6 years, guys. Get over it. Whereas now you're okay, I can see why 8 years after this they came back and did 2 seasons. Again, it's a really fascinating dynamic.
What you're saying basically is that Christian is the X-Files. Essentially. The kid is the missing link, Darren. Give some praise.
Close enough. And it's not very subtle. There's a Christian child named Christian.
It's a bit like Lost, isn't it? It's a bit like Jack's dad in Lost being called Christian Shepherd. It's the same kind of thing.
Well, there are some, let's be frank, some wonderful names here. Is it Mosley Drummy? Is one of the great Chris Carter names. But the fact that Christian's parents who are afraid are named Mr. and Mrs. Fearon.
Fearon.
Yeah,
yeah.
The father who's putting a bar on this, who's serving as a barrier to Scully. His name is Father Yabara.
It's all there. It's all there in the names, isn't it? Yeah.
Again, I'm not critiquing this. We've talked about this. I absolutely love this sense of Carter's lyrical kind of poetic quality, the unashamed kind of literacy of it, where it's just no, I'm gonna put my themes directly in front of you. This is a lofty work of art that has things to say. I'm not just bringing back Mulder and Scully to make a knockoff of Silence of the Lambs. I'm also going to work through my relationship to God, which I'm sure we'll talk about in the next couple of minutes, but also I'm going to work through my relationship to the show. And again, you ask, is Christian a metaphor for the X-Files? This is a movie that owes a lot to Frankenstein. And again, people will have talked about it more on other minutes before and after this one. Not going to go too much into it, but Carter, as a writer, as a director, absolutely fascinated by Frankenstein. The postmodern Prometheus is a great example of it. And the postmodern Prometheus is 110% about the X-Files. Like, it's the episode that's like Carter being like, I have created this thing. I have lost control of this thing. It has taken on a life bigger than I expected it to. It does not belong to me exclusively. My version of it is not the only version of it that exists. It's also, it's Morgan and Wong, it's Vince Gilligan, it's Frank Spotnitz, it's Howard Gordon's version, it's the fans' version, it's fan fiction, it's fan art. It exists. It has a life beyond what I have given it. And by the way, if you're rewatching the Postmodern Prometheus, take a note of how the inventor is styled with his crop of white hair. But I do think that it is. I think there is an element of that here as well. And I think he's coming back to the Frankenstein motif. As you mentioned, this is a Frankenstein movie, in that it is a movie that has been Frankensteined. But also it is a movie that is riffing on the concept of Frankenstein, which is one of Carter's pet themes. But also is something that Carter comes back to repeatedly whenever he's thinking about the show and his relationship to the show, and the idea that he's created something that does have a life beyond what he gave it, as constructed parts that he never would have chosen to give it, that he never would have chosen to give it, because I can use words good, that he never would have given it had it been his choice, that he wouldn't have intended, and yet it turned out the way that it is, and it's this kind of beautiful monster, so to speak. So I absolutely do think that there is a sense in which this is a movie about the show that Carter has created, and I absolutely do think that Christian is kind of tied to that as well.
That's really interesting, way of looking at it, obviously. And we'll come back and we'll talk a bit more about the end of this scene, and then the scene that follows in minute 57, which is coming very soon. So thanks a lot, Darren. It's been a lot of fun. We'll be back for minute 57. Thanks for listening, guys. And remember, until next time, trust no one.